Hello and welcome to the Happiness Festival, hosted by the Happiness Institute in association with Gowing Life. Today we're talking with Emily Thomas. Emily is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Durham University. Her work primarily centres around the philosophy of space and time, but she has recently authored a book called The Meaning of Travel, where she explores why we travel and what benefits it can have, which is what we'll be discussing today.
In 2019, there were 1.4 billion international arrivals globally. Given that our planet only holds 7.7 billion humans, this suggests that before the lockdown, a lot of us were travelling. The World Tourism Organization looks at the motivations for this. And last year they reported that one of the major motivations is travel for change. People are looking for local experiences, authenticity, personal transformation. I think that this trend is fueled by curiosity about the unknown and the unfamiliar. Humans have always been looking for new experiences, new ways to live. If you open any travel magazine, check out any travel blog, you'll find it littered with articles about overlooked places, unknown tourist destinations. And this curiosity has a really long history. Just to give you a couple of examples, there's a really lovely passage in one of Mary Kingsley's travel books through Africa, where she describes the sheer good pleasure of canoeing down an African river by moonlight and how she delights in finding places that are not down on maps. You also find the same sentiment in Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, where he talks about how inviting the blank spaces on Earth are and how he hankers after the blank spaces on maps, preferably the biggest and the most blank. I think that this unknown, this unfamiliar, is what philosophy and the benefits of travel are all about. So what I'm going to do in this talk is say a little bit about what the philosophy of travel is, and then I'm going to talk about what philosophy can tell us about the benefits of travel. So I'll start off by talking about what the philosophy of travel actually is. Although travel is really obviously about exploring places that are unknown to you, philosophy is less obviously about that, but nonetheless, I think that it really often is. So if we go back to 18th century Irish philosopher George Berkeley, he likens one of his groundbreaking books on idealism to a long voyage that involves difficult travel across wild mazes of philosophy. Similarly, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, about halfway through his book, A Treatise on Human Nature, imagines himself as a sailor who's been shipwrecked. He's struck shallow water, he's stuck on some rocks, and he's thinking to himself, is it really safe for me to continue? Perhaps I should just stay here where I am, perched on this rock in the middle of the ocean. Maybe that would be better for me. But instead, Hume decides that he will screw up his courage and enter back onto that boundless ocean which runs into immensity, despite the fact his philosophical boat is leaky and weather-beaten. The philosophy of travel right now is not a thing. It's not something that you find lecture courses on or conferences themed around. There aren't any big BuzzFeed lists of great philosophical travellers. But I think it should be a thing, and that actually it's quietly been a thing for many centuries, that philosophy and travel have for a long time been enjoying a kind of love affair. Travellers and philosophers are both interested in pushing at the limits of their knowledge. They're interested in seeing what the world is really like and how it is elsewhere. Adventurous travellers are really interested in finding new places. They want to visit the moon and distant planets. They want to see what the far parts of the ocean are like. In the same way, radical philosophers are trying to push the limits of human knowledge. They're trying to ask questions that no one has ever asked before. They're trying to figure out new areas of inquiry. Over the course of history, we've seen philosophers ask brand new questions. What does it mean for a state to be good? What is time? Does the future exist? These questions, there was a time when these questions had never been asked, and philosophers are trying to ask them, to push against the bounds of human knowledge. Now, you might think that wishing for the unknown is the only thing that philosophy and travel have in common. That travel is all about taking boats and trains and remembering your passport, and philosophy is all about heavy books and bearded Greeks. But in fact, the history of philosophy and travel has intersected in various places. It's tangled together. Travel has affected philosophy, and philosophy has affected travel. I'm going to give you some examples. Travel can help philosophers develop new questions. So, for example, in the 17th century, we have this great voyage of discovery going on where people are setting off in ships to find new lands, new trade routes. They're trying to colonize places, and they begin bringing back information about these distant parts of the world. Philosophers begin reading about them, and it prompts them to ask questions that they hadn't asked before. For example, John Locke begins wondering whether people all over the world think the same about ethics and religion. Locke was a voracious reader of travel books, and he concludes really quickly that people have really different views on the same issues all over the world. So he looks, for example, at the way people are describing cannibalism in various places, in Georgia, the Caribbean, and Peru. He's looking at the different attitudes people take to the sex lives of various saints, and he's looking at atheism. And Locke believed he found atheism running rampant in Asia, especially China and Thailand. Some of the reports that Locke was reading were erroneous. So we know actually that reports of cannibalism were greatly exaggerated. We know that China and Thailand are not, for the most part, atheist countries. In fact, they have long religious histories. They just weren't the kind of religion that Locke was familiar with. But nonetheless, it was becoming clear that across the planet, people disagree on fundamental issues in ethics and religion. And Locke uses this to mount an attack on innate ideas. So Locke asked the question, does everybody around the world think the same? Do we all have the same ideas that we're born with? And he uses travel literature to argue that we clearly don't. Today, I think travel is still prompting lots of new questions. So we can ask about the ethics of doomed tourism in the light of climate change. Is it really ethical to visit places that might be perceived to be doomed because of rising sea temperatures, rising air temperatures like glaciers or coral reefs? Travel invites us to wonder what non-human thinking minds might be like. If we're going to travel into outer space, what kind of stuff are we going to find there? And just as travel has moved philosophy forward, philosophy has sometimes pushed travel practices into new directions. So every now and then, a philosophical idea comes along and it impels people to visit a particular place in a particular way. So there's this really beautifully written book by Marjorie Hope Nicholson called Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory. And she argues that before the late 17th century, people conceived mountains to be really ugly. They were ugly protuberances, boils upon the face of the earth. And then what you get from the early 18th century is a reversal of this view, that suddenly you have people like John Ruskin describing mountains as great cathedrals upon the earth, altars of snow. Nicholson asks what was behind that transformation. And she argues the answer lies in a new philosophy of space. Thinkers like Henry Moore and Isaac Newton argued that space is God's presence on earth, and that led people to associate wide open spaces that seemed kind of infinite with God. That led to the transformation of infinite seeming landscapes like mountains, or as I also think, seascapes, to become really positively viewed, even divine. Other examples we can give of the way that philosophy has affected travel include things like Henry Thoreau's philosophical book Walden, which is all about the importance of valuing wilderness. And Thoreau is still quoted every time someone new goes into Alaska and builds themselves a beautiful log cabin. Or, for example, cabin porn, which if you Google with your safe search settings on, you will discover gives you beautiful images of log cabins perched above lakes, above glaciers. And there's even a book, and several journalists have remarked that Walden is the inspiration underlying this desire as well. So I think that love of the unknown and the new is what drives a lot of the interactions between philosophy and travel. And that's when I think the philosophy of travel is at its most interesting, when it's pointing us towards the borders of things that we don't yet know about. What I'm going to move on to now is asking what philosophy can tell us about the benefits of travel, like what it can do for us. Philosophers have always argued that travel is important. So we have, for example, Francis Bacon in the 16th century arguing that if people go out into the world and travel, they'll bring back information, and this will actually bring about the apocalypse, but in a good way, because the apocalypse will lead to the refreshing, the renewing of the world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that travel was essential to education, that it could help you grow as a person and kind of finish you off. Henry Thoreau thought that wilderness travel would heighten our appreciation of nature, and that we would come to value nature more highly if only we wandered off into the wilderness and picked huckleberries. I want to focus on something really specific that travel can bring us, and that's a benefit that's discussed by the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. So Montaigne spent several years roaming Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and he talks about travel at length. One of the things he says is that travel shows us the diversity and variety of the world, that it forces the soul to continually observe new and unknown things. One way of putting this is to say that travel forces us to observe otherness. What I mean by otherness is that feeling we get when we come into contact with the unfamiliar. So it's the feeling that things are different or alien. My favourite travel books come with a strong sense of that feeling. So Sarah Wheeler wrote a book, Terra Incognita, where she's wandering around Antarctica. The book is littered with descriptions of a world that sound as though they could be on another planet. And there's something really wonderful about that. Another of my favourite books is Eric Newby's A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. It's very funny. And during a long trek through the Afghan mountains, he picks up a phrase book, the local language, Bashgali, and the phrase book reveals just how unfamiliar life in those mountains is from Newby's perspective. So some of the phrases that Newby learns how to say includes things like, I saw a corpse in a field this morning. I have 9 fingers, but you have 10. A dwarf has come to ask for food. Clearly, these are not phrases that Newby would be using at home, and he's including them to show us just how unfamiliar the place he's moving through is. When people feel otherness, depends on who you are. Each of us is unique. We have a unique background set of memories, cultural beliefs, desires, and that's why travel books are as much about their writers as about their places. So if a glaciologist had visited Antarctica, she's going to have a very different experience to Sarah Wheeler, because what was familiar and unfamiliar to the glaciologist is going to be different to what's familiar and unfamiliar to Wheeler. This is something that Montaigne repeatedly reminds us of, that what is unfamiliar to one person is just daily habit to another, that each of us are situated uniquely in our societies, in our backgrounds. Now, Montaigne thinks that the great thing about travel is that it brings us into contact with unfamiliar things, and this is really good for us. He thinks that coming into contact with the unfamiliar improves our minds. There's a really wonderful way that one traveller put it in 1642, and he says that the fruits of foreign travel include delightful ideas and 1,000 various thoughts. And I think that's the kind of thing that Montaigne is getting at here, that it's useful for us to experience the unfamiliar. Descartes, for what it's worth, completely agreed. Descartes goes off on one about how being part of an unfamiliar society can make you question assumptions that are so deeply held you didn't even realize they were assumptions. And again, this is really good for us. Questioning deeply held beliefs and traditions and assumptions helps our minds to break out of ruts of ways of thinking. This, of course, is exactly what philosophy does when philosophy is at its best. It helps us to break out of traditional, long moan ways of thinking. Right now, we are in the middle of an international crisis and an international lockdown. The crisis has brought all kinds of big evils, but one of the smaller, lesser ones it's brought is the fact that travel is now so restricted. It's impossible, in fact, for most people now in the world. And that's sad because it cuts us off from one of these ways of experiencing otherness, of experiencing the unfamiliar. I don't think that means it's impossible. We can still learn about the world in many different ways. We can read books, we can watch documentaries, we can do things like this, where we listen to people talk about topics that I previously didn't know anything about. And these are good things. They are good ways of getting in touch with the unfamiliar. But when the lockdown is lifted, I think it will open up again an easy route into discovering things that you didn't already know. And that's something that I am really, really looking forward to. So The philosophy of travel considers the way that travel and philosophy can push each other towards new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking. And out of all the things philosophers say that travel can give us, I think the way that otherness can help our minds to grow is the most important. That seems really good for us. And that's it. Thanks.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for that talk. I've really found that very interesting. And yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So I think now we'll jump straight into the question and answer. So first, I wanted to start on your sort of experience of traveling. I know you've sort of spent a bit of time in the Netherlands, and you went on a trip to Alaska. I think that's right. Just tell us a little bit about your personal experience and how it sort of grew you as a person.
That's a really big question. It's a big question because I spent really large chunks of my 20s traveling, several years, in fact, backpacking around the world on very little money. And it grew me as a person in lots of ways. But I think the biggest was this sense of visiting places and not understanding almost everything that I was seeing. And that was a really useful experience, realizing how much world there is out there and how little you know about it was a really positive experience. It sounds like it wouldn't be, but it really, really was. And it definitely has fed into becoming a philosopher, in the sense that philosophy is all about making you question the things that you thought you knew or the things you took for granted. I think that is the best thing I took from it. With the Netherlands, I actually lived there for several years. So that felt less like traveling and more like it actually integrating into a society and really getting to know it. I feel like when I am in Holland, I really understand what's going on around me in a way that I don't visiting most other countries. And then Alaska, of course, is just the most beautiful place. If you ever get a chance to visit, I highly recommend that. Once the lockdown lifts, I'd love to go back.
Oh yeah, I would absolutely love to go there. And a point that you just raised, which personally I'm really interested in, is your time living abroad. You said obviously that's different from traveling. You know, I've, again, like you, I've traveled to some parts of the world, and I often think to myself, can I see myself living abroad? Because I've spent, my whole life living in the UK. Do you think that's something that traveling helped you move to live abroad? And do you think that's a good step for a lot of people who have maybe thought about it and have doubts whether they think that's a good idea or not?
I certainly love living in the Netherlands. It was a really positive experience. And I think that all of the earlier backpacking was helpful, in the sense when you move to a new country, you don't know how the banks work, you don't know how to call a plumber, you can't read the labels on food packets until you've taken the first language course. And I imagine it would be more of a shock moving somewhere and finding you don't understand everything if you hadn't already experienced that previously. I think that lessens the shock of it. But it really did feel different in that, I learned some Dutch. I figured out how the plumbers and the banks worked, how you weigh your vegetables in 1,000 different ways in all the grocery stores. It was a different experience, actually. And when I go back to the Netherlands, it still feels like home in a way. I can read the things going on around me, and I can't in other places.
Okay, and how, to go back to the beginning of all sort of travel for leisure, where did that start? Why did the first people think, right, what I want to do is go to a foreign land and do that as a pleasurable thing? What was their sort of thinking?
Travel, as the mere activity of moving from place to place is riddled throughout the entire human history. That's clearly been going on for tens of thousands of years. But as you say, this precise idea of leisure travel, of spending your free time voluntarily traveling, is quite a new idea. And as far as I can tell, it really started in the 17th century with the Grand Tour. So when you read books about travel from the early 17th century, they quite often start by listing the different kinds of travelers that they are. And they include things like merchants or soldiers or refugees. What they absolutely do not include is tourists. So this idea of leisure travel really got going with young aristocratic men largely. It was quite a British craze, although you did find young people of other European countries doing it. And the idea was that you should go abroad when you were sort of 17, 18, maybe early 20s, and become cultured. That it would help you perfect your languages, that you would see all of these beautiful ruins in Italy, you'd learn some more history, you would probably buy some paintings and some rugs to show just how cultured you were when you got home. And this idea of the Grand Tour, it just became really embedded in European culture. And gradually you see it becoming cheaper and cheaper, and people with lesser means are able to do it. So suddenly by the late 18th century, you actually have tourism opening to the middle classes. And then it becomes much closer to the kind of tourism we see today, which isn't open to everyone, but is open to large swathes of people.
And we see so many people, and I personally have friends who who have trouble with sort of things like mental health in the UK in their sort of daily lives. And I see them go abroad, whether it's to travel or on holiday, for a break of 2 weeks or even, 6 months. And it's like so much of that weight is lifted off their shoulders. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about how travel can help alleviate those pains.
That's a nice question. I think travel can always give you new perspectives on your life and on the life of the people around you. I think it's very easy when you're in one place surrounded by the same people, the same things, to get stuck in particular ways of thinking. And travel just breaks you out of that. It shows you alternative ways of viewing the world. And that can be really helpful, I think. It gives you a fresh perspective when you go home. Maybe things that were bothering you then seem far smaller in the light of other things you might have seen abroad, or just that you've been broken out of negative patterns of thinking. I think it certainly can be very helpful. I mean, some people argue the opposite is true. So Alain de Botton, in his book on travel, has this famous line where he says, "Oh dear, I forgot that when you travel, you take yourself with you." He sees this to be a terrible thing, but not for everyone. For some people, it's a really positive experience.
Yeah, that's certainly in my case. That's that's a situation. But so for traveling and the benefits that you mentioned, is there sort of a checklist of things that need to be ticked off in your travel? Does it have to be a certain length? Do you have to go and visit certain cultural or historical landmarks, or is it very personal to the individual and what's important to them?
I think it's always going to be personal to the individual. To get some of these benefits are going to be very specific. So if you're with Rousseau and you think you are traveling to become more educated, then I would imagine that visiting culturally important sites and reading lots of books about history while you're there is going to be really important for that. If you are trying to echo the Rue, then you're going to want to get deep into the wilderness. You're going to want to travel beyond the local fields behind your house. You're going to want to try and go further into the local forests and really try and get away from humans. I do think because travel is so widespread now that it's really easy to travel without experiencing otherness. So you can book a package holiday to France, be surrounded by other British people. That you arrive, you're still surrounded by other British people. You can order British food off an English menu, and in that way, you're still kind of cocooned in Britishness, which for me would make it very difficult to experience the unfamiliar. So depending on your background, I think it can be a little bit harder to break out of that, but it's definitely still possible. You just have to go a bit further afield and try and immerse yourself in the local society as opposed to surrounding yourself with people from your home country.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. A recent trip to Southeast Asia showed me it's almost you could do the whole trip and not speak to a single sort of native person, and it's great for some people and it's not for others. But I suppose, like you say, completely up to the individual. And another thing, like there's a school of thought, I think, with the current sort of Instagram generation, that if you don't take a picture of something and upload it to social media, did it ever happen? And with the rise of social media, how has travel evolved in these recent years?
There has always been an element of show to travel. So even these young aristocrats on the Grand Tour, they are coming home with their paintings and their ancient historical coins, and by way of showing how cultured they are. So I don't think the element of showing is new. I think what is new is that it seems to change the experience that people have while they're there. So spending 30 minutes trying to get the perfect Instagrammable shot is something that just wouldn't have happened before. I'm not sure it's good or bad. I think it's just a new development in the way that people are approaching travel now. Oddly enough, when I was in Alaska, I met some Instagram stars who I won't name, but I went out with them for an afternoon, and it was really eye-opening to see there were various costume changes along the way. Like they were really expert at positioning themselves to get the light and yeah, there's a real art to it. But it felt very professional, actually, like they were working whilst they were sightseeing. And that is definitely a different kind of thing to just sightseeing.
Fair enough. Well, I think Avi might have some questions about this topic as well, and other topics as well. So I'll let him say his part.
Emily, thank you for the excellent talk. That was quite fantastic. You're a very thoughtful orator. Like you actually kind of thinking through as you speak yourself. So that was quite wonderful. I hope you don't mind. So I'm going to take Chris's a question that he was talking about Instagram. Then I'm going to expand on it, and I'm also going to delve, because Chris so far has talked about the good things, and you have also talked about the good things in the philosophy of travel. But I'm also going to talk about a little bit of the gray side, and maybe even a little bit of the dark side, because I was born in India, and I have slightly different experience of travel than maybe other people from Europe have, and my friends and colleagues like Chris has. Whereas Chris went to Asia, I kind of moved over to this part of the world. So it's a little bit different experience. So I want to talk about, I know that Thomas Cook went out of business just last year, but I mean, Thomas Cook started with, kind of like an Instagram culture. Like it started with the getting, if I remember correctly, the story was, I think it was, where did they take the train? I know they took it to Loughborough, but they took it from another place with an L. It's not Liverpool, because I think their Liverpool trip was later and it was big. But it was basically a group of temperance movement people coming together to take a day trip to Loughborough, seemingly. It's a wonderful place. But
I cannot remember the name of the place either, but weirdly enough, I can picture an illustration.
Yeah. Leicester. It's Leicester. So Leicester to Loughborough was where the first Thomas Cook trip was. And what I was thinking is that all the way from that to, the world is now flat. Not that it wasn't flat in 1840 or whenever it was. And we have hyper-connected and globalized world to the extent before this virus. But we are also in a filter bubble kind of situation. So I just would like you to elaborate what you think is the future of what Chris and you were just talking about, which is that Chris was just mentioning that when he was traveling in Asia, people could just hang with English people. So this idea of package tours, planned holidays, I mean, Thomas Cook kind of industrialized it, as far as I know. So what do you see is the future of this hyper-connected, globalized, but filter bubbled world?
I think the future is going to hold things that are both good and bad for travel. So if you think that travel should involve coming into contact with the unfamiliar, I do think that's going to get harder. Globalization seems to be ever increasing, with the same shops, the same restaurants popping up all around the world. And if that's the case, it's going to get harder to find shops and restaurants that are not familiar to you, to find places that aren't familiar to you. So that's something that worries me a bit. But I think it's always going to be possible to get away from that. Paul Theroux has this lovely analogy where he compares travel destinations to a menu, and he says that things drop off and drop on the menu. Most obviously, if there's a natural disaster or a war, a place is going to drop off the menu for a while, but then it will come back again after. And when it does, it's going to be a long time before it becomes familiar again, in the way that perhaps places in Southeast Asia have become familiar to British travellers. So I think that will not be good. Good things, I think we are going to see ever loosening restrictions on travel. So as a European, I don't need visas to go to a great many countries. I would imagine that as an Indian, you need visas to visit many more countries. I think that will get easier. I think as travel seems to be ever increasing, these things are going to relax. And I also hope that this crisis in particular leads to a rise in slower travel. So rather than someone taking 3 weeks off work and taking 5 mini flights to visit 5 cities, spending time instead in one region with just one set of flights, and getting to know a place more, encouraging slow travel rather than fast hoppy travel. I hope that what's happening with this crisis will have a positive impact on the climate crisis. Perhaps that was too positive for you. Maybe you wanted more negative answers to those questions.
No. I want to hear your insight. I mean, you are the author and the philosopher. Chris, feel free to jump in. But I think you brought up. You brought up the point of visas, and that was actually going to be my run-in. Is that NPR, the National Public Radio in the U.S. I cannot remember which show did it. I think it was Planet Money. So I always want to cite my source, where they followed the manufacturing, the creation and transportation and delivery of a T-shirt. So, for example, many companies they go to Etsy or something like that and they order a T-shirt, but they don't know where it came from or where it got printed or where it got made. So they followed the journey of a T-shirt, and it traversed through, I think, obviously you would think Bangladesh, but it traversed through about 40 countries before arriving to them in New York. Please don't quote me on the number of countries. But what I was just thinking is that you're 100% right. Wikipedia actually has an article or a set of databases, which is you can put in the name of a country like UK or India and say visas for, and it shows you a map of the accessible world to you. And as an Indian, I think without visa, I have access to, 8 countries. Whereas my colleague Chris has access to, 200 countries or 196 or something like that. I think what the NPR show showed that a good or a product can actually traverse more countries than a human has. So a human is more legal or illegal than goods or services. Like it's a strange world. But I'm glad that you brought on the point that it is going to change in the future. I guess it is already changing for many places and many people.
But my guess, I have not looked at the history of this, but my guess is that if you were to look at the history of it, that it has been a history of ever easing visa restrictions. I would imagine, especially with the growth of tourism, that you would think countries, it's in their interest to ease visa restrictions just to get tourists.
I would think so, and I'm glad. My questions. It's as if you have actually seen what I've written it down here, because the data is actually what I was going to talk about. Is that you present a lot of ideas about how different authors through time have written about other cultures. I would actually. So I'm a cell biologist and biomedical scientist myself, like Chris. I would actually like to know that. I'm going to pronounce this researcher's name incorrectly. Gerd Hofstede, cultural dimensions. He classifies cultures along, I think, 6 or 7 dimensions, and it's more for a business school kind of thing, how to assimilate and or integrate, or in your workplace if you have people from different cultures, or if you're doing business in another country. But I wonder that if you look at the history of travel, whether it be from Thomas Cook onwards, whether you actually find amalgamation and people actually learning. So this is your and Chris's discussion and your presentation, all an overview of that. Do you actually see people go from a higher cultural dimension, or whatever it is, like the very different cultural dimensions, and Gerd Hofstede's cultural dimensions is just one type of dimension, but whatever it is, do you see people go from one cultural dimension to a very different culture and then actually understand and take things back home with them? I mean, the Silk Road is a great example historically, but do you see that happening over time? Do you see that cultures imbuing other cultures with their values and their notions and things like that?
I have definitely seen it with regard to philosophy, without a shadow of a doubt. You see the history of Western philosophy starts off being relatively local. So if you look back at the ancient Greeks, for example, there's a lot of evidence to say they were borrowing stuff from Egypt, but that's relatively close to Greece. They're not going that far afield. Later, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, you have all of the neighbouring European countries borrowing from each other. But as the world has opened up further, now you see Western philosophers actively borrowing from places that are farther away, so Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy. And this has always happened a little bit, but my sense is that the more travel becomes available, the more idea sharing there is.
To sort of touch on this point more thoroughly, and to allude to what you and Avi were chatting about before, about travel being different, one, because of the limitations between different cultures, but obviously we've talked a lot about the Western culture here. Is lots of my friends go traveling for quite a long time as well, not just a few weeks. Is that a culture which you see around the world in other sort of in other cultures, or is it mainly sort of entrenched in the Western culture?
What I can say is I've looked at statistics as to which countries are producing the most tourists, and certainly Western cultures are driving that, but around the world, other countries are catching up. Tourism is becoming an increasingly big thing all over the world. I suspect tourism is always going to be driven partly by money, and in the West people tend to have more disposable income, but that's obviously not true exclusively. There are many wealthy non-Western countries, and tourist numbers are increasing all around the world as a result. And I would hope that as you see the world generally become wealthier, that travel and tourism will follow quite naturally on the heels of that.
And say if I was if I was looking to travel to try and add to my happiness and overall well-being as a person, and I came to you and I said, Emily, how can I use travel to improve my life? Like, what advice would you give me?
I would say follow your interests. Pick something that you're interested in and you don't know a lot about and go there. And I think that for everyone, that's going to be different. For some people, it might be that they have always harbored a secret desire to go mountain climbing and they just haven't done it. For other people, maybe they've always desperately wanted to visit Delhi and they've never done it. So I think it's going to differ by person, but you've got to follow your interests. There's no point just going traveling because you think you might like it. It's got to be something that you have a faint inkling. I really want to know more about this.
And as a final question on my part, what makes you happiest? That can be traveling or anything in life. What makes you happiest?
Right now, during lockdown, I am absolutely with the home baking crew. That is all I have. It feels like reading lots of books and baking cakes. In life, generally, there are other pleasures. Coffees, traveling, these things become possible. But right now, books and baking.
A great answer. I can't argue with that. Perfect.
I have one final question, and I think this is what we ask all researchers, is that if you had all the money in the world and could do whatever research you would want to, what would it be?
Do you know, that's really difficult because this is really difficult because my answer is so geeky. I'm currently writing a book about early 20th century theories of time, and I would literally continue to write that book. It is abstruse and technical, but it's really fascinating. And I think I would just continue to do that. I have a list of books I would like to write after this one, and having infinite money would certainly make it easier to write them more quickly. But I really am quite content to be working on what I'm working on right now.
I think we could have a whole another discussion about, because I know you work on the philosophy of space and time, and yeah, I would love to carry on for many hours asking you questions about that. But I don't want to take up too much of your time. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us for this talk. It was absolutely fascinating. Really enjoyed it.
Oh no, well, and thanks guys. This is a fantastic festival you're putting together. It's really cool. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much.